Welcome back. You're listening to Through a Glass Darkly Radio on United Public Radio. The intro music that you listened to was Mark of the Doomslayer by Carl Casey at White Bat Audio. And today we have one of my favorite guests who's appeared many times on Through a Glass Darkly. And today will be his first appearance on Through a Glass Darkly Radio. And that is Preston Dennett. Now, Preston Dennett is a field investigator for the Mutual UFO Network, a ghost hunter, a paranormal researcher, and the author of more than 30 books and more than 100 articles about UFOs and the paranormal. So I want to extend a very warm welcome to my friend, Preston Dennett. Preston.
Hey,
welcome,
Sean.
my friend.
Thank you.
It's always great to see you.
Always great to be here. Thank you.
All right. So there's been a lot of stuff in the news. It's been kind of crazy town in UFO world with the Arrow report that was, basically gaslighting of the entire American people, which was fantastic. But today I just kind of want to go way back. You spent your entire career working on tabulating the accounts of experiencers and contactees who have reported various types of ETs in their experiences. So what I want to kind of do tonight is go through, using those reports that you've tabulated as primary source documents, kind of what are the most common ETs that you see, and then kind of go through each type, describe kind of similarities that you often tend to see in different reports, and then we can kind of go from there.
Yeah, sure. Well, it's kind of an endless parade of different types of humanoids. So it's, in some ways easy to categorize, in other ways hard. One thing I did notice right off the bat was they are humanoid, which I thought was super interesting, because that's sort of what kept me out of the UFO field. It was very Star Trek-like. I'd hear about it on TV shows every now and then. Not like today. It was pretty rare. But
right.
Yeah, it was always humanoid. And I thought, just don't think ETs would look that way. Of course, I was just assuming based on my own assumptions, which turned out to be pretty wrong, actually. But my first case involved typical grays, as you would think of it, from a family member, actually, who was walking by Stagg Street Elementary School in Van Nuys, Southern California. This was back in the late 1970s. She was a college student. She's an artist. Got a great eye for detail, but described, the typical grays. She said they were about 5 feet tall, very slender, wearing olive green jumpsuits with mandarin collars. She's an artist. She's got every detail. But huge pear-shaped heads with very large, liquidy, dark, wraparound eyes. Almost no nose or mouth. White as chalk. So that was my first case. And that was followed shortly later by someone at work. A lady who's dead.
What year was that? Like, how far back was that?
That was, we pinned it down to about 1978.
Okay.
But it could be, a year or so in either direction. She was in college. It wasn't her first year. It wasn't her last. So it was somewhere around there. But yeah, she was close. She was walking on the sidewalk, and they were standing in front of the school of all places, right under the floodlight. Her dog was with her. Her dog, Sarah. Dog didn't react at all. So, but close enough that she knew these were not human. She first thought they were kids as she walked up to them. People wearing masks, going through what J. Allen Hynek calls theory escalation. Because your brain doesn't want to go, this is aliens. It wants to find a normal, conventional explanation. So that was my first. It was grays.
And what time of night was that? You said they were standing underneath the light.
It was approaching midnight. So okay. So she thought they were kids, but it's far too late for kids of that age to be out. They were closer to 4 feet rather than 5 feet, but they're about.
What did they do when she when she kind of got too close and then realized that they weren't kids.
Yeah, it was really interesting. She said, because actually when she approached, they were facing each other so close it looked almost like they were kissing, but they weren't. They just appeared to be looking into each other's eyes about inches away. And as she walked right up to them, and she's maybe 10 feet away, they swiveled and kind of turned like opening a book, is how she described it. She said they almost seemed to be floating an inch or two off the ground. She couldn't confirm that because she didn't really look down to see at their feet. Didn't really see their hands or their feet really at all because she wasn't paying attention to that. But they locked gazes with her. I mean, they stared right at her. And she said it was like being woken up when you're already awake. It was a complete revelation. And she didn't want to panic. She's a pretty tough lady anyway. But she didn't scream or panic or run. She just walked away as fast as she could without running because she did not want to panic. And didn't look back. Doesn't believe she had missing time. But she did have an earlier sighting, just months prior to this. So that could be a connection there. It's something we do see, a sighting followed by a closer encounter. And it turned out her son would later have a humanoid come into a glowing blue being. And this was, of course, decades later. She's married and has kids. My nephew was about 8 or 9 and he had seen a UFO right outside his bedroom window, pretty high up there. This is in Topanga Canyon, California, a known hotspot. Right. And it was shortly after that he was with his friend, and they woke up in the middle of the night to the room glowing, and this glowing blue being came in. And he doesn't really remember anything other than that. No real detail to it. But fits the pattern. I mean, this is in my family. We know this as researchers, that it does tend to run in families. So
was the glowing blue being, was that different from a gray?
I would say yes, but I can't really say for sure because he was so young. It was so brief. And, he would start to forget about it. And I'd go up to him, every time I went to visit, I'm like, you remember, right? Because I know how these things work. I'm not going to let him forget. And he's like, oh, yeah, that's right. So he didn't get a whole lot of detail to it, unfortunately. It could have been. It might not have been. The best he could say, it was humanoid, and it was glowing. So, I mean, I wish there was more detail to it. And he hasn't had anything since then. But my other nephew did have a very close-up sighting while swimming in a pool in Hawthorne, to the south of LA. And
that's where SpaceX is, right?
Is it? I don't know. That's where.
I don't know if it still is, but it certainly was there for a while. It probably is still there.
Yeah, well, it's not too far from Seal Beach Naval Weapons Station, and California is riddled with stuff like this. But yeah, he saw a very close-up UFO. But yeah, so that was my first case of a humanoid. And it was a gray. And it's funny because there was a few books out there. There was Betty and Barney Hill's book. I think Jim and Coral Lorenzen had a book out, and Charles Bowen's book, The Humanoids. But there really wasn't much else. I mean, there was a few. There was a book on Roswell, Betty Andreasen book. But she had never read any of those. She had no conception that this was even being written about. And didn't even use the word ET at first. Until I was like, you know what? As she's going from head to toe describing this, I'm like, gosh, if she says these, details, the big eyes, the white skin, I'm going to lose my mind. And that was for me a tipping point. Like, there is something to this. There's no way she could know this. And I'm predicting what she's going to say. So yeah, my first case was Gray's. So was my second. Lady I worked with, I'll call her Diane, because she did not want her name used, but she and her whole family had seen lights over Camp Julian in the San Bernardino Mountains. This was, again, late 70s, I think. But both the young daughters, who were, teenage, 16, 17, 18, started seeing UFOs over Reseda, and a crowded suburb area. You wouldn't think anything could show up there, but they did. And that was when the youngest daughter, who at age 19 woke up to see grays in her bedroom. And they're like, I asked her, what do they look like? And she says, honestly, I didn't get a really good look at them because I took one look and they scared the living daylights out of me. But she said they had very light skin, very large dark eyes, were super skinny, looked almost like leathery reptilian kind of skin, she said. And they said, come with us. Don't be afraid, but you need to come with us. She started arguing with them, like, I can't go. I have a job. I have a family. I have to go to school. I can't go with you. And next thing she knows, and this is all recalled fully consciously, she's lying in this round room, very small, on a table. They're surrounding her. And they said, can we cut your arm? And she said, no. They did it anyway. And then they said, well, we need to do an operation on your brain. And she just lost her mind at that point and fell unconscious. But I talked to her like the next day. She didn't work where I worked. This was her mother who I worked with. And she told me this. And she says, well, she's coming in today. You can talk to her. And I did. It was like the day after 2 days. And she's like, yeah, and here's where they cut my arm. And I saw the little healed up scar. It heals up very quickly. And this is what she described. She ended up having 4 visitations where they'd come in and talk to her, gave her predictions, actually. They said, you're going to get a raise at work. You're going to have some trouble with your boyfriend. They talked a little bit about religion, interestingly enough.
What did they say about religion?
Nothing that she could distinctly recall in any detail, just that they seemed to be interested in it and what her thoughts were on it. But she said the stuff they told her did actually come true. And she said ultimately it was a benevolent experience. She doesn't feel like they were out to harm her, even though it was really scary. And she just says, I wish they would just knock on the door during the daytime and ask, because coming into my room at night, really scared her.
Yeah, why? In all the research that you've done, have they ever alluded to the reason that they do that specifically, they being the Greys? Like, come at night, don't kind of come under normal circumstances?
Well, not in a whole, not really, somewhat. I did interview Dolly Safran and wrote a book about her case. And it's her understanding that the reason they do that is because they know where they're going to be able to find you. And you're undressed, you're relaxed. They don't have to fly around during the day when the magnetic fields are more unstable. They're more stable at night without the sun, coming down and wreaking havoc. There was various reasons, but for whatever reason, people have a hard time with it. As, people ask, well, where are you most likely to see ETs? In your bedroom, honestly. That's where most people will see them. Or, on a craft, of course. And sometimes walking down the street or on a lonely highway or what have you. But that is most common. Bedroom visitations, they're called. And my third case was Gray's as well. A lady I'll call Wendy. Basically, I met her when I went to go see Max, the Crystal Skull, who happened to be coming to my neighborhood. And I thought, well, why not? Crystal Skull sounds interesting. And it was. I don't know what to think of it, really. I didn't get any magic vibes from it. But it certainly was interesting. And she sat next to me. And we just started talking. I'm like, oh, yeah, I'm interested in UFOs. And she's like, oh, well, I've got a story for you. And she was originally from Georgia. And as a young kid, had these guys coming into her room. And it went up all through till young adulthood. And she, again, described Greys. And very scary for her at first, until she started waking up to all these psychic abilities, and they healed her of a cyst. And it's just kind of went from scary to really deeply, profoundly spiritual for her. But yeah, Greys again. And it went like that for a while. Um, grays, until I started to get other cases. I got a Bigfoot case at one point, but human-looking ETs, praying mantis, those would be the top three by far, I would say. Grays, then
Now,
human-looking, then praying mantis.
so staying with the Greys for a little bit, have there been like a cluster of potential location? By the way, I know the answers to many of these questions because we talked before. So if it sounds like I'm asking you, like I told Sean that, it's yes, you did. I'm doing this for the audience. So have they ever been pinned down or mentioned where they're from at any time? Or are they from multiple places, or is it still kind of a mystery?
Well, in my own files, it took a long time to get any real solid answers. But of course, I read everything I can get my hands on. And the Betty and Barney Hill case, which was one of the first to get any publicity, seemed to point towards Zeta Reticula.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look into that, it's not really a place for planets. But that did come up in other cases as well. I started to hear all kinds of stuff that you couldn't really verify. Orion kept coming up.
Mm-hmm.
And I finally did start getting cases of people who were told by the Greys that they came from the Orion constellation, somewhere in that area. Dolly pinned it down. I'm like, okay. She's like, that's the third star. There's the one right below it. That's their sun. I'm like, wow, because I just interviewed another guy, Mike is his name, who basically had that pinpointed as well. And other people have told me that. But often I won't get answers, or I should say the contactees won't. Because I interviewed a couple from Hawaii who were driving through Sedona and had a UFO in front of their car, kind of made them follow it. Then it would go behind him and follow them. And finally it dived into the ground, or so they thought. But when they got to their hotel, it was 2 hours later than it should have been. And they were having some partial recall. Not really, but they certainly had a history of encounters, both of them, separately and together. But did go under hypnosis with someone who has done this before, an experienced hypnotherapist. And he couldn't recall anything, but she did. She recalled being not taken on board so much as this craft landing in the field and a door opening and them waving over. It's like, do you want to come on board? I said, sure. And they were largely human looking, though probably more accurately, I don't know, hybrid. I hate to say it without more information, but she said they were human looking and had large dark eyes and bald heads, but could have passed for human down the street if they wore a hat and glasses, sunglasses. Were about 5.5 feet tall, were slender, did look very much alike. And that's an important detail because anytime I get human-looking ETs, they're described very much like twins or brothers and sisters, very close to identical, if not identical. And she had the requisite physical exam. Her husband was taken to another room, and he was presumably being examined. And she's asking all these questions, like, who are you? This, where do you come from? Is what she asked them. And I said, well, we're from a place. What did they say? It's not important. We're from a place you understand. And that's what they told Melinda Leslie, another lady I interviewed. It doesn't really matter where we're from. You don't need to know that. And often they'll give coy or evasive answers, which it's frustrating, but in some ways understandable because we're so violent and ready to shoot first and ask questions later. That would you give your home address to someone?
No.
But
no, if somebody were operating in the U.S. military on foreign soil, they wouldn't even give their name.
Yeah, most cases that they'll say something like, well, I won't say most, but in a number of cases I've gotten, they'll say, it's not important. You wouldn't understand. We're from up there. This sort of thing. Slightly coy, slightly evasive. Or sometimes in the literature, certainly, they'll be like, we're from Mars, we're from Venus. Like, no,
Yeah,
you're
it
not.
depends on yeah, it depends on like how early in human history it is, right?
I think that sometimes they will deliberately place kind of elements of high strangeness to just sort of give skeptics a way out, a doorway out. Like, I'm not believing this because this was said, or
Right.
even the experiencer themselves. I don't know, because there's these weird high strangeness elements to it that sort of force people to consider new ideas, perhaps, or think out of the box, or change the way of thinking. But yeah, it's hard to say where exactly they're from. But I would say Orion for sure. Some have said in the Andromeda galaxy, and I'm like, no, that doesn't pin it down at all.
Right.
Why would you? And so,
Yeah, it's like
yeah.
saying I'm from the Milky Way galaxy. Well, yeah, so am I. Where?
Yeah.
What about motivations? Did they ever say why?
Oh, certainly.
They're here.
Yeah, and this is much more easy to pin down after you interview.
And they again specifically the Greys, because there'll be others.
Yeah, well, it's pretty much the same motivation across the board, apparently. I mean, this is my assessment based on the first 10 cases that I've researched and what I've read. But I think it's pretty easy to pin down because, yeah, some people are taken on board and they're losing their minds and they don't get any information other than the ET saying, calm down, calm down, calm down. And the person basically goes unconscious and they don't get any information. But those who have a little bit of calmness and don't have a huge fight or flight response do get information, and we'll ask and they'll tell you. And basically they will examine you. This is most common. And they say, well, you've got this problem. We're checking up. You're doing well. You're progressing fine. This is exactly, you're at the right stage. So it apparently is about health. And I really kind of came to that conclusion pretty early on when I kept getting healing cases. And that was the subject of my first book. Because I found 100 cases ultimately over the space of a year, yeah. But 30 right off the bat. I mean, I just did a quick scan of the literature. I'm like, well, here's 30 cases. What is going on here? People aren't talking about this. They're acting like, oh, they're experimenting on us. And I'm finding people who are healed of cuts and bruises and nearsightedness and rheumatism and cysts and cancer. And I mean, you name it. Now I've got 300 plus cases, which I've collected basically. So that, and they will tell you this flat out. They're like, oh, well, you've got a problem with your stomach. You've got an issue here. Are you aware that this sort of thing? Some people have no idea. Some do, that they're ill. But then they will basically, I think one of their primary agendas or missions or goals is to impart information. And that would take the form of 3 or 4 different general messages, one being warnings against nuclear proliferation. That's huge. It's usually the first thing that comes up. We know where all your missile bases are. We can stop them. One guy said that. And they showed another person maps of every single anything to do with nuclear. They basically will tell you, you're destroying areas you don't even know about. You're on the verge of total self-annihilation. What are you doing? You need to tell people to stop doing this.
Right.
So it's also one lady up in Maine, they told her flat out, you need to tell people that thoughts are real, that if you keep sending out the negativity and the greed and the corruption, you're going to destroy yourselves. We did that in our distant past, and you're on that pathway. You need to tell people to stop putting out this greed and anger. They're warned against war and aggression. That's pretty common. They warn against pollution, the destruction of the environment. And sometimes it goes beyond that. They'll actually, predict and say, these events are going to happen. Hurricanes, earthquakes, landslides, I mentioned hurricanes, but, generally major earth changes or even social changes. They told one lady who was a diehard supporter of Ross Perot, said, you need to stop doing that. If you need to get out of the political system, it's going to fall apart. There's going to be a civil war at some point between all of the people in politics. And if you are a part of it, you're a part of the problem. Stop it. And she did overnight. She said her political aspirations went right by the wayside and she stopped doing it. One lady, she told me, well, now I'm just collecting seeds. That's what they wanted me to do.
I got a super thanks question from Moonman. Thank you very much, Moonman. But just to step in really quick, and then we'll get back on the thread. Preston, have you ever heard of the ETs building hidden infrastructure or building infrastructure that is co-located with Earth but not accessible to us? That they describe it as what humans might call dark matter.
Not really in those words. No, I can't say that I have. I think there's a lot of speculation about underground bases. And some people do report being taken to what they perceive to be an underground base, but they can't really tell because they're not really looking outside and seeing everything. And it could very well be just a large craft underwater, or for that matter, in the ground. There is evidence of stuff on the moon, I think, that comes from the contactee perspective as well as from NASA insiders and what have you.
Yeah, to your point, I think last week there was something on Google Earth that it's still on the U.S. Geological Survey website, so it's off of the west coast of the United States. There's a west coast anomaly in the kind of, it's very, it's like this oval shape. It's very clear. Yeah, and then Google scrubbed it, literally scrubbed it last week. So
I heard about that. Yeah, the Malibu anomaly. I dug deep into that because some guy very early on sent me the coordinates and said, you need to look into this. This is where you're getting all these reports of USOs. It's right in this area. I'm like, well, yeah, it is. And this does look unusual because it had this very flat, smooth surface, what looked like pillars, what appears to be a tunnel. It's Sycamore Null. It's an earthquake fault. I've always been kind of on the fence about it because some Google images show what looks pretty much like a natural geological formation, and others, gosh, it looks like a tunnel there. And some of those, they do look like pillars. And I was leaning towards the artificial structure, and I still do, actually.
It's too perfect to be something that's purely natural.
Yeah, right. And I think what really clinched it for me, because I ended up writing a book about USOs, and that was a whole chapter in that book. Because Jimmy Church ended up using Google applications to really get some astounding images, and he popularized it. It's like, wow, there's something to this. But I interviewed, the guy who wrote the song "Wipeout," Merrill Fankhauser, who got all into this because he started using some weird beeping tones that were coming from that area, from unsourced location in that area, from a radio ham who was picking it up, and they could not pinpoint it, but it was somewhere there. And he used them in his songs. And so I was kind of emailing back and forth with Merrill, and it's very sweet to respond. But he emailed me back a year or two later after I'd put out the book and said, I've got some news for you about this Malibu anomaly. He said he was in Las Vegas and met with a Chumash Native American elder. They, of course, being the people who inhabited that area for a couple of thousand years prior to, the Americans, or Europeans, I should say, coming over and taking over. But at any rate, this Chumash elder said that they are aware of this structure and they did not build it, but that they that the sea level, according to their oral tradition, was much lower at that time, and they could actually fish off the edge of it. But the implication was it was built. So that, I'm like, wow, well, they would know. They were there. They were on it. They have a long oral tradition. We know that Chumash, Gabrielano Indians, Native Americans, lived there. So
do they have a sense of who built it, though?
No. But if you look at it, it looks like it could. It looks built, but it's obviously very weathered. And we know the sea levels changed dramatically. You can find seashells up at the top of the Topanga Canyon, Santa Monica Mountains. So at some point, the water was way higher, and course, we know lower too. It does fluctuate with each ice age, I guess. I don't know. I'm not a geology expert by any means.
But you said there was the thing that confirmed it for you was the um, what the singer or the writer of the Wipeout song kind of his
Yeah, Merrill
testimony.
Fankhauser talked to a Chumash native elder.
Oh yeah.
I'm like, wow,
Yeah, the thing that cinched it for me is that Google erased it. That's what cinched it
yeah.
for me. That tells me that somebody in the intelligence community doesn't
You know,
want the normal people seeing that, so it means it's real, whatever it is,
I was kind
and
of
it's
one,
significant.
I was mapping all the sightings out of USOs and UFOs, and they were clustered black over this thing. I wonder if there's something in this area. And that was before I even knew about it, had heard of it. So I'm like, oh. And someone did tell me that there was actually tunnels that lead from, let's see, Edwards Air Force Base out to this Catalina Channel there.
There's
Which
tunnels from Edwards Air Force Base to this thing.
I've had 2 or 3 reports. There's one guy who's kind of your typical whistleblower.
Mm-hmm.
He said that. Now, I can't confirm that in any
Right.
capacity, but I thought it was interesting because it came up more than once. And that is where, oh gosh, what's the name of it? Well, there's San Clemente Island where they do the naval seals, which is just beyond Catalina Island. And then there's the port, that's at Port Hueneme Naval Base, is right at the north end of all of that. I mentioned Seal Beach Naval Weapons
Mm-hmm.
Station. That's the south end. I mean, this place is heavily militarized. We know they know about the USO activity because they've been asked directly from MUFON researchers. So yeah, we're aware of the rumors of an ET base, and they're not true, and we know nothing. I've talked to, one guy was a submarine navigator who had an encounter. He contacted me. He had an encounter in that area. So that was a really interesting interview, to say the least. But another guy was an officer on the USS Long Beach who had an encounter on the far side of Catalina Island that completely put that ship on red alert. So he was another good witness. And they're like, we don't know what it is. And there's a bunch of cases where these objects are being basically chased by jets, almost 10, up to 20%. It's clear the military does not know what these are. And for that matter, the cases go back to the 1920s, earlier, well before we had presumably anything that could fly like, these craft are being described as, stopping on a dime and going in and out of the water and doing all kinds of things we certainly officially can't do.
Random question for you, since we're still on this topic. Have you heard any stories about Lake Tanganyika and there being a possible USO base there? All right. So here's the reason I ask. 2 weeks ago on this station, I interviewed Lynn Buchanan, and we were talking about kind of the 4 famous ET bases that he, Pat Price, Joe McMoneagle, and others saw in remote viewing. So it was like Mount Hayes in Alaska, Mount Perdido in Spain, Mount Zeal in Australia, and then there was another one in Zimbabwe. And then he kind of said, oh yeah, and then I said, well, what was the name of the one in Africa, in Zimbabwe? And he's like, oh, was it Tanganyika? He's like, oh, and his face kind of went white. And then 30 minutes later, somebody knocked on his door. And so he had to get up in the middle of the interview, and it was somebody who came to his house at 9, 10 p.m. his local time, so
Right.
pitch black. And they were saying, do you need your, asphalt redone? Right? Have you ever tried to look at asphalt without any illumination? And, he's like, you have cracks in your asphalt.
All right then.
Anyway, he, I don't think he was supposed to say that. I mean, it could just be somebody was going around from house to house legitimately asking about fixing asphalt, but I don't know. Anyway, that's just something to look. And by the way, I looked into prior sightings, and there's a ton of, well, not a ton, but I found at least 2 in the 1950s that were around Lake Tanganyika. And I think the implication is that there's, again, I don't, I'm inferring from contextual clues. So what I'm saying could be completely wrong. But if we had a treaty with somebody, that's where one of them might be. I think it's the longest lake in the world.
Well, I can tell you could, and I challenge you to do this if you want. Take your hand randomly, your finger, and spin the globe, and I can find a sighting there, hands down, within 50 miles of it. That's how active, UFO activity is on this planet. There's not a location on this planet that doesn't have some history of encounters.
Okay, all right. Now I derailed us. Now I'm going to put us back on the track, which is we talked about grays. Now let's talk about human-like ETs, and start with some of the particular characteristics that those type of encounters have, and then where they might be from.
Yeah. Well, I wish I knew where they were from. Again, that's why this field needs a lot more research than it's getting. But people call them Nordics. I kind of moved off from that terminology because it's not accurate, and it's a little bit prejudice even, because they're not always white-skinned. Yeah, there's often some blonde hair, blue-eyed, human-looking descriptions. But right off the bat, I started getting ones of all different, ethnicities, I guess would be the best way to put it. Ancestries, call it what you will. But interviewed Stan Hughes is his name. Really good witness, very smart, a Native American. He's an author. He described how he was in the Idaho Panhandle driving at the base of Thunder Mountain one morning. He's got a history of encounters too. When a silver spherical object landed on the road in front of him, and he sort of started moving into this sort of Oz factor that you hear about, where there's this eerie silence kind of pervades the environment, and almost a sleepy feeling. But at any rate, he was fully awake, and the door opens, and out steps this. He says, I'm married, I've got kids, but this man was beautiful. I'm like, okay, well, describe him. He said, well, he was over 6 feet tall, 6.5 feet tall, broad shoulders, very muscular, wearing, let me see if I can get this right, it's a blue suit with silver boots and dark skin. I'm like, well, what do you mean dark skin? He says, well, he looked Middle Eastern to me. He had, long shoulder length hair, dark eyebrows, very dark eyes, a beatific smile, and just peace and wisdom resonating from him, in love, actually. And he felt like he was a long lost relative. He being Native American of the Seneca tribe. He calls them the Woj, which is basically the star people, and believe that they are related relatives. They're progenitors, which is probably true because that does come up in a lot of contactee cases. But yeah, he felt an absolute connection to this man who looked Middle Eastern, but very handsome, and basically held his hand up and sort of gave a palms forward greeting. And he thought to himself, to the ET actually, take me with you. I want to go with you. At which point the man's smile kind of dropped and he turned around and went back into this thing. There was no door, it just opened and then it closed. And it took off. So it was a pretty brief meeting overall, less than 5 minutes, closer probably to 1 or 2. And as soon as it went, he broke down crying, just there on the road, crying over his steering wheel. I brought him to my home several times, and did face-to-face interviews, and still in touch with him. He's a great guy. And he weeps pretty much every time he tells the story. I mean, he will at least get teary-eyed, but if I make him dig into it, it's very emotional for him.
Did he get the sense for what the motivation of this visit was?
He said it was purely a hello. That was his sense. Just a connection. Like, we know about you. We're watching over you. You're good. That sort of thing.
Well, Preston, how come you and I don't get hellos? Well, you might have got a hello, but I don't get hellos.
Yeah, well, I don't know. It's hard to say. I did have a missing time encounter. I've had some very close-up sightings. It's accelerated from there. I'm gonna have to write a book, Sean, because now I'm in it. neck deep. Well, over my head, I should say. I'm in it. So I've gotten the hello, which is really awesome.
Say some more. I think you may have told me about this, but let's just for the audience. You can't say that and then not say what the hello was. Everyone's sitting on pins and needles right now. They want to know.
Oh gosh, all right.
If you can. I don't want to.
No, I mean, I don't have any problem talking about it because, it started out slowly for me. I was very reluctant to say that, I'm involved in this. I'm just a researcher. I'm stepping back. I'm objective, right? Because I don't want to lose that. And because people they frown upon that a little bit. I'm not so sure that's the right way to do it, because if you really want to know it, you got to experience it. Like Margaret Mead, I think it was she who said, you become a part of who you're studying. And I think that's absolutely true.
Real quick before you finish, I have to say this. So you're watching or listening to Through a Glass Darkly Radio on United Public Radio. Thank you very much. And one thing I want to put a pin in, because I want to acknowledge this. Thank you, Chester, for the super thanks. When we get through this, your experience, or after you finish discussing your experience, Preston, if we could share your thoughts on the Chris Bledsoe case, but put a pin in it and we'll get right back to that. Anyway, this is very personal, so I do not want to diminish it. I very much want to hear what you're.
I'm not sure how far to go, but I mean, because I could talk for quite a bit on my own personal experiences, which, like, as I said, I had an orb come down, had missing time, which was followed by another sighting where UFO actually spoke to me and did say hello. I mean, it flat out said, "Hi, it's us."
How recently was that?
That was 1994.
Okay.
So that was a while back, but that was when I was interviewing my third case of Grays with Wendy, I call her. And she had lashed out and kicked a Gray in the neck and had hybrid babies and was describing all this stuff. I'm like, is this lady for real? Because I'm transcribing.
Oh, is this the lady that killed a Gray by breaking its neck, right?
Right. Yeah, she thought she did. And I was yeah. I mean, in brief, she saw them around her bed and jumped up and kicked it in the neck. And that stopped the experience from them taking her, at least for that time.
Right.
But yeah, I was describing hybrid babies and this was a full-on case. It's pretty much extensive as they get. So I was like kind of scratching my head about it, thinking, I know she's for real, but I can't quite wrap my head around this. What's going on?
It's a lot to take in.
It was for someone who was pretty new to it. I mean, I was 5 years in, but still, it was new to me. But that's when I got this very strong impulse to go onto the roof of my condo. Uncontrollable, strong impulse. I mean, I was up there before I even knew what I was doing. And grabbing my glasses, by the way, which I don't need for driving. I'm just slightly nearsighted. And we'll use them for driving at night, usually. Actually ran down 3 stories to get them out of my car. Ran back up and onto the roof of the condo. And I wasn't up there maybe 20 seconds, probably closer to 10, when this UFO appeared right across. There was a parking lot, the little LA River, and then the other street. So a couple 100 feet away. But it was a giant orange oval, probably 20 feet across, 10, 20 feet, right above the apartment building across the way. And it blasted me with a message, and it said, hello. I got my hello. And they said, we're Wendy's ETs. We're for real. She's telling the truth. If you don't believe, well, watch. We'll prove it. And it wasn't in English. It wasn't sequential words. It was bam. All at once in 1 second, that message came. Very clear. I'll say that. I mean, there was no misunderstanding that at all. I understood exactly what they were saying. And then they did it. They went back and forth, stopping, darting, getting lower and lower so I could see that it was how close it was. This wasn't distant. It went below the trees. So that's how low it was. And then it winked out. So that was one of my first hellos, but it progressed from that. I mean, I'm having dreams of being on board and seeing babies that don't quite look normal. And one time they came down over the frickin' freeway. I'm driving down the 405 freeway. Well, up actually, north from San Diego. I'd visited a friend and was going back to LA. I'm like, what the hell is that over the freeway ahead of me? Mind you, this is at night, and that 405 freeway is one of the worst in the world. It's never empty. And we're whizzing along. You know, everyone drives at 70 miles an hour on that thing. And I was. But I slowed down as I'm coming over this thing, because I know the freeway well enough. I've done this trip 100 times. And there's this giant globe over the freeway. It was a low cloud cover, maybe a few hundred feet, maybe upwards of 1,000, but I don't think so. I'm looking at this thing more. I'm like, that's not a building. There's no way that's a street light. It's a huge white, yellow globe of light, maybe 100, 200 feet up, right over the freeway. And, you know, I didn't stop. I don't know why I didn't pull or stop and, you know, freak out, because you don't expect it, right? And you're booking along.
Yeah.
And as I'm getting
these strange things always happen when you least expect them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But as I'm going right under it, I'm like, well, okay, well, because it was a little hazy. And I'm like, well, I'm going to see something attached to it. There's got to be an explanation. But there wasn't. There was nothing attached to it. There was no explanation. It was totally silent. Of course, you know, you're in the freeway and it's pretty noisy. There were cars around me. No one's paying any attention to this thing. And you would. I mean, if you saw this, you would pay attention to it, because it was big and it was right over the fucking, the frickin' freeway.
FCC's gonna get you. I think we're allowed to do that. I'm over cautious.
I rarely swear, but this one got me.
That's okay. That's
just
okay.
Not a swear, but this one got to me, because as I came right under it, I knew it was unusual, and that's when I got a message. And again, it wasn't words, you know, but it was very clear that my niece was born, that my niece had been born.
Oh, wow.
Now, I knew my sister-in-law was pregnant, but I wasn't thinking about it at the time. I knew she was close to the due date. I didn't know the due date. But I'll never forget that day, July 9th. Because, yeah, I went home. I'm like, well, gosh, you know, I'm going to certainly call her up and find out. She's, of course, the one who did see the grays. So maybe there's a connection there. My sister, of course, also.
What year was that? Sorry, what year was the freeway thing?
Gosh, I wrote it down. I'd have to pin it down.
July 9th. We know it's July 9th.
July 9th, the year 19. I don't know.
So we're still 20th. We're still
1998.
Still 20th century. We're still 20th century on that.
98, 99 around there.
And by the way, like, that's kind of, there's tons of reports like that where somebody will see something and nobody else around them will. Like, that's the Ray Hernandez case, is very similar, right? Okay, I didn't mean to interrupt your flow, because you were, you know, this is fascinating stuff. And the less I talk,
yeah, but I mean, it went on from there. I mean, I'm reluctant to talk about some of it because I want to kind of write about it, you know, but I did at one point have a fully conscious onboard experience, so which was very brief, but
let's see if there's without, because you do need to preserve that so you can write a book about it. But when you write this book, any like snapshot that you can share, like grays, is the inside bigger than the outside, is like just
I'll tell you, it was the best experience ever, you know, and I knew it was happening. It was on my birthday, and I find myself hurtling through the sky. I'm like, well, I'm being taken, and it's finally happening, and I am ready to leave Earth forever. I don't want to come back. This is happening. I'm fully awake. This is out of my home in Reseda, 2021, not too long ago. I mean, this is fairly recent for me. And I found myself in a craft, laying on the proverbial table with, a hybrid human-looking lady with big, weird-looking eyes, but a beautiful blonde woman, but not fully human. I mean, you could tell her face was not fully human. Mm-hmm. And they were so worried about me. Like, are you okay? Are you okay? And I'm fine. You know, I've had out-of-body experiences, and I felt that vibrations and done interdimensional travel, I guess. And
so did this feel like a fully physical experience, or was there like you feel you were in like a subtle body, you were in like an astral body?
I was a little confused at first, but ultimately it felt physical. Yeah, it was just hard to wrap your head around that you're actually physically on there. But well, just moving along, because it wasn't a super long experience, 5 or 10 minutes. But I saw a tall gray.
Well, real quick, did you get a chance to fly the machine?
No, I sure didn't. No.
Okay, all right, I'll stop. Okay, go continue. I had to ask that.
But I met a tall gray, and she looked down at me, and she's like, "So, is it what you thought it would be?" I said, "Actually, it's much better. Can I go exploring? Can I walk around? Like, go ahead." And it was just this. You can probably see how far away the bookcases are. 15, 20 feet. Yeah. It was not much bigger than. It was like a very large room. Not a gymnasium or anything, but house-sized. And all, the typical rounded walls. There was banks of windows all around, and it was so much fun. There were people there. Some were lined up kind of in rows and a little bit dazed. I mean, not a little bit. They were out of it. Because I walked up to them like, "Isn't this cool? Isn't this great?" And they're like, "Dee, dee, dee." And others were fully conscious and just having a great time. There were some very alien-looking dudes kind of standing guard and being very unemotional. And yeah, it was the most awesome. I had drank the alien drink, but yeah, I'll go more into it at some point. But
yeah, I'm not gonna.
That's how it ended. They're like, "We want you to drink this," and I'm like, "Oh, okay, sure."
Like the ambrosia, the nectar of the gods.
It's funny because I've read about, I did a whole thing in one of my Not From Here books, alien drinks, because people describe these as neon pink or green or bitter or juice, kind of fruity, and all these different descriptions, right? And they hand me this thick glass tumbler, yay big, not a giant beer mug or anything, and it was about half filled with this kind of pinkish liquid. And I'm looking at it, I'm like, "Huh, okay." Or no, wait, let me think. It was greenish. I'm sorry, not pink, it was green. And I'm like, "Okay." And I sniffed it, and I'm like, very subtle. And so I drank it, and it was thick. It was twice as thick as water. Not as thick as pancake syrup, but like a smoothie, but definitely liquid. Syrupy, I guess, would be the way of putting it. And it tasted like kiwi lime. Very subtle, slightly sweet. And I took one sip, and they took the glass away. And I'm like, "Wait, can't I have another sip?" And they looked at me with absolute astonishment. Like, "Really? You sure?" I'm like, "Well, yeah. I mean, I just want to taste it." And they allowed it, but apparently this was not something people normally do.
Did they tell you what the purpose of bringing you up there? Just to like say hello or to give you more comfort?
I think it was a birthday present, honestly. I had been asking and asking and asking. And I've got more I want to talk about at some point.
Yeah.
About all of that. So I will spill the beans.
That book. You got to write that book, Preston, like immediately.
Yeah. I mean, it was the best thing ever. I can't tell you. To be in this field for that long and finally get to see something, so fully conscious. Because I've had dream recall of fully being on board.
Because now you know. It's not like you're 100%. Listening to other people's stories and you believe them, but you don't know for yourself.
Yeah, you get this first, you get this certain, you visualize when people say, "Oh, the walls are rounded." I'm always thinking, it's round like an egg. No, they're straight walls, but they come down at a curve like that. Yeah. It was just the coolest thing ever. I mean, I lucked out on this one. It was the best experience ever. I'll never forget it. I woke up in bed like, "Oh my God, this is unbelievable."
And then, okay, so the Chris Bledsoe question, I need to go back to that. What do you make of that case?
Yeah, well, I kind of knew about Chris Bledsoe for a while because he's kind of popped onto the scene when he went public. And I'm like, wow, this sounds like an interesting case. And I met him at UFOCon in Sacramento, I think it was, and made it a deliberate effort to, meet with him because he had a healing case, which I studied. He was healed of Crohn's disease. And I found that really compelling because he was out camping, had his friends there, his son, They all saw UFOs. He had missing time. They all saw grays. I mean, this was a very well-documented multi-witness case. And Chris Bledsoe was basically wheelchair-bound and was cured of Crohn's pretty much overnight. I mean, by that experience. No longer needed medication. It's a very well-documented healing. One of the best out there. Certainly in the top 20, I would say. And meeting with him in person, I'm like, you're in my book. Would you like a copy? And he's like, oh, wow, that's really nice of you. And he was a really kind, very sincere gentleman. And I have no doubt that he's having experiences. I mean, certainly fits the profile. I have not vetted his case in the way I personally investigate people. But yeah, I'm a supporter of it. I find it interesting. He's blending a lot of religious and spiritual elements to his case, which is not that unusual, but he's farther along on the bell curve for your typical encounter. But yeah, I think he's legit. I really do.
Okay, so we're still on human-like encounters. What other things have you noticed about or similarities that people typically have?
People will always describe the eyes as being particularly hypnotic and very mesmerizing, usually a little larger than normal. They're almost always described as being genetically flawless. I mean, beautiful. One guy I interviewed who was healed, actually, and he's a good witness. I mean, he's a reverend, or you may have heard of him, Michael Carter. He's fairly well known in the field. He's an author. But we've become, colleagues, if not friends. And he described his healing of a blood clot by a typical Nordic-looking human. I call them human-looking, but his was Nordic in appearance. Like
somebody from Scandinavia, basically.
Yeah. Very tall, blonde hair, blue eyes, extremely wise and friendly. The descriptions you get. Wearing a jumpsuit. So fairly typical. Another guy I interviewed who had a load of experiences would only share the one that took place at Leo Carrillo Beach. It's like, I'll give you this because you're researching this area. But I want you to know I do have a lifetime of this, and it would take days and days to share it all. But I'll share this case with you. He was at a party with a lot of people, by the way, on Leo Carrillo Beach, which is sort of north of Malibu. And it's off the Pacific Coast Highway. There's a little wooden staircase that goes down. It's a fairly large beach with lifeguard towers and the whole deal. It was an impromptu evening party with about 50 people or more. And at some point, people noticed lights out in the water, big, bright lights floating on the water, some distance out there. And he was out there, walked up, and they were all kind of standing in a row watching these when one of the lights detached and raced far faster than it could to the right. And next thing they know, they all turn around because everyone's oohing and eyeing because there's this enormous bright stadium light shining down from the top of the parking lot there down towards the beach. And everyone kind of goes into a complete trance or daze or hypnotic trance when 10 or so human figures, human looking, wearing blue jumpsuits, start walking down the stairs and walking among the people. And his first impression was they were carrying books, but later he started having flashbacks of these were some sort of technological iPad kind of device. And they're walking among everybody, and no one is paying any attention to them at all. And he's like awake and unmoving and not really able to respond. But he said that they were 5 feet tall, short, all had the same hair, short brown hair. They were male and female. They all looked like brothers and sisters, almost identical, which is something you hear. But one climbed up to the top of the lifeguard tower. He's like, I don't know how he did that. They're fenced off. There's no way you can really get up there easily at all. But he looked up, and one of them was on top, signaling to the lights out there in the water, which apparently are still there. So he's watching all this and looking at everyone who's dazed, and they're just walking among them in a weird way. They're paired off. And So what the motivation is, I have no idea. He had some memories of being on board following this, because they did have missing time. The next thing he knows, he's standing on the beach with about 10 of the people in a row. There's these weird marks around each one of them. And it ended the party. Everyone went home. Nobody talked about it. It was
What year
not
was this?
remembered. This was 97, if I have that correctly. It's in
By
my
the way,
book.
thank you, Bruno. Thank you very much, Bruno, for the super thanks.
But yeah, it was a super interesting encounter. And he started, he spontaneously remembered it like a few days after. He's like, oh my gosh, I'm remembering this. I must be losing my mind, because how can this happen? There was so many people there. And he didn't know all of them, but he knew enough. And he started asking everybody, and they're like, what are you talking about? No people came down. And some are like, well, yeah, I remember seeing the lights in the water. Is that what you're talking about? And he's like, well, yeah. And one person had some memory of somebody coming down the stairs. That's it. He was really the only one who remembered that he could find. Remembered these figures walking among them. But those are human-looking ETs. He said they looked Mesoamerican to him. Not dark skin, but sort of Peruvian, Mexican, some along those lines. Very, sort of plain-looking, but in a, genetically very organized features. No, anything that looked, abnormal in any way. Very.
Why do you think that is? Do you think that's because they're all biological clones and they're just designed to have whatever the golden ratio in terms of facial features and body features, i.e., perfect features, or what do you think drives that? Or is that a glamour? Is that a glamour that they use?
Yeah, I'm not willing to say that this is a screen memory or an illusion or anything, something that they're hypnotically putting over people, because it's so consistent. I think this is just my assessment, mind you, because I can only speculate that based on what people report to me. But it's very consistent, and I don't know why they're described that way, other than they've overcome the problems that we have in terms of, hair lips or scars or anything that might cause facial abnormalities or deformities, or what we would perceive as not the optimum type of beauty, I guess. But certainly people describe him as being very handsome and very beautiful, whether, female or male. So it's very, very consistent in that regard. And I suspect that they just have good genetics and take very good care of their genetics. I don't know. I really couldn't tell you.
Maybe they're not as... They have better ways of protecting themselves from...
Yeah, well, I should say that it's not always true, too, because there was a guy I interviewed from Canada who had an encounter at Wasaga Beach, which is, a very popular tourist destination along Lake Ontario. And he took an impromptu walk with his friends. He's like, let's take a walk. Let's take a walk. And they're like, no, what are you doing? It's late. He's like, come on, let's just do it. He felt this impulse, and he's had been doing CE5s vigorously, really wanted to make contact and had. And this was that pattern, people have a close-up sighting and then it escalates. And this is exactly what happened with him. He's walking with 4 friends and suddenly they stop in lockstep, foot in the air. The moon looks real big. The silence comes over. The waves kind of flatten. It's the Oz factor in full force. And he's like, guys, what's wrong? Why aren't you moving? Hello. And they had all just noticed some people down by the beach that looked really unusual. And he turns and he's looking at them. He's like, God, they look tall. And next thing he knows, boom, probably missing time, but he's in front of them now, face to face. And he said they were at least 12 feet tall, probably closer to 15. And we talked about this for a while. He's like, listen, I'm 6 and I think he said 4 inches tall. He says, you better not use my name. I will kill you if you use my name. I'm like, I'm not going to use your name, I promise. But he's a businessman, a philanthropist, very successful, quite young. and very spiritually minded, all into, the pyramids of Egypt and philosophy and Eastern thought and meditation. But standing in front of these guys, frightened, because they are very tall. They're wearing black jumpsuits. They're human looking, but not, because they're huge for one thing, but their chins are jutting and their foreheads are massive, and they've got big, big eyes that are slightly wrapped around. He said they had green irises with gold-lined green irises, different, and jagged teeth. Not, and the skin was very thick and wrinkly and not particularly attractive. Not what we would think of as your typical human looking, but basically human looking. And he's like, "You're not supposed to be here." He doesn't know why.
To these giants.
You're not supposed to be here.
Right.
He thinks they showed up because he was calling out to them. He wanted to see an ET, and they told him, "Well, we can come and go as we want to," in chorus, in a thick, gravelly voice, which he's not sure if it was telepathic or not, but he's leaning towards not. But it was in chorus, which is interesting because I hear that occasionally from witnesses. But yeah, he was right next to them and had to look up like that. And he's a tall dude. But so you get to this point where, like, gosh, well, humanoid, but are they human looking?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's trillions of galaxies, right? So, like, you would have to expect that there to be, God knows how many different civilizations out there. So,
yeah, but I can say that
you're not going to see all
the
of them.
contactees, by and large, if you have any regular communication back and forth, you're going to get the message at one point, like, we share a common heritage. We're not that different. We come from the same place. You are us, we are you, we are one. It's some variation of that. And I read about it too in other cases. I'm like, well, there it is again. Barbara Lamb has cases like this, John Mack. The researchers who I really respect, and they're the ones who dive into the onboard experiences more than, perhaps other, because there's all kinds of niche explorations and researching you can do on the subject. But I love the first-hand contactee cases, and especially when someone's taken on board or meeting ETs face-to-face and getting communication with them. And that comes up so much. And they're always humanoid, almost always humanoid.
How are these cases, or how have they been in the last, 2 to 3 years? Are the cases kind of contactees picking up, slowing down? Have they gone away altogether?
Well, I can tell you from my own personal experience, I don't have any over the past 2 years. I have one, I should say, which came from a guy in England. I call him Gary, who's had contacts with grays and human-looking beings. And he says this was early last year, that he had a gray, which I suspect is one of those little AI grays, the 3 foot tall, non-emotional, very short, little tiny, which I think are AI grays. That's really the only one. So yeah, severe drop off, right off a cliff drop off, which kind of fits what Dolly Saffron keeps telling me and keeps repeating over and over again, that, listen, guys, they're not here right now. Our magnetic fields of our planet are collapsing. We're facing an existential crisis. And as scary and weird as that sounds, there's good science to back this up if you start researching that. And it's a very common message from contactees that we're facing a very uncertain future. Get ready, guys. Which I think speaks to the fact that many contactees are very concerned about the environment, have moved off grid, are saving food and water, are worried about a social, socioeconomic collapse. So that could be what's going on here. Certainly in my own files, I'm just not getting them. And initially I'm thinking, well, it takes people a year or two, sometimes 10, 20 years to even find the courage to come forward to talk about this. People have missing time too. They don't remember. So there's a number of factors that it's a long road to finding someone to talk to for a lot of people. And I was putting, well, maybe that's what's going on here, but I don't know. There is a drop off, and you can see this if you go to the files of New Fork and MUFON. You'll find lots of little white lights and orbs and people describing all kinds of things that could be anything. But in terms of humanoids, and onboard experiences, and the people, because I'm in contact with people who are regular experiencers, and they hear this and like, well, it's true. I haven't had anything in 2 years now. I'm like, well, okay. So that is where I'm at right now. That's my assessment.
Okay, now in terms of let's go to the mantis or the mantids or whatever you want to call them.
Yes.
Yeah. Let's talk through kind of the common scenarios you see them in, and from your case files.
Yeah, I interviewed one lady. Actually, went to speak for her MUFON group in Thousand Oaks. Jeannie is her name, and she's like, "Well, if you want, you can interview me. I saw mantids." I'm like, "Okay, tell me what happened." And she kind of came to a sudden awareness of her encounters when she was having all these dreams about UFOs and telepathic communications, and remember waking up in a quasi-sleep state and ETs are talking to her, and she perceived that they were little grays, but she couldn't really see them. And then one day she wakes up in the middle of the night in the bathroom and spontaneously recalls that she had just had an encounter with a 9-foot tall, kind of grasshoppery praying mantis looking being, who was basically putting an instrument of some kind down her throat in an unpleasant procedure. And she described it in detail as looking very much like, a mantid bug, very much like we see here on Earth. That was one of my first cases. Her recall is pretty sketchy. She doesn't really remember a whole lot of going on board or anything like this. She does have the idea that someday the sky's going to fill with craft, and it's her job to help scoop people up and put them on board, which is something a lot of contactees say. But certainly an interesting case that stretches all the way back through childhood with grays coming in. It's not unusual for people to report grays and mantids and human looking, at various times or together. That was one of my earlier mantid cases. Probably my favorite was Kevin Kamin, who passed away, sadly, about 2 years ago. But I liked his story because, I went to speak down in San Diego and he was in the audience, and I'm talking about a mantid case and I'm putting up some of the drawings. And he came up to me, 6 foot tall Navy medic. And he's like, that's not what they look like to me, but it's darn close. I'm like, oh, well, what happened to you? And he described an experience where he was on a Navy ship and his bunkmate, well, I'll call him Lewis, that's not his name, said, I'm a contactee. They take me to their planet. They've been on their ship. I've been visiting them since childhood. And Kevin's like, oh, yeah, sure you are. You're truly a contactee. I want to meet your little green friends. And Lewis is like, okay, I'll arrange it. And comes back a week later and says, well, they took me to your house. I saw the orange shag rug and the milk stain, the milkshake stain on your Camaro or whatever it was. And he describes Kevin's house in detail. Mind you, they're on a ship out in the Mediterranean, or, actually the Pacific, the sort of the Bermuda Triangle area, but not really. If I remember correctly. So Kevin's freaking out. He's like, did this guy go on shore leave? Obviously he didn't. So he's like, well, how did you know that? He's like, I told you. They took me to your house. He says, but you're describing my house as it was 10 years ago. He's like, oh, am I? So it was doubly confusing for him. And it was, but he says, you know what? They agreed to take you. They're going to come, in a couple of days. I'll let you know when. And he comes into the bunk one morning and says, okay, it's your break time, right? And he's like, yeah. Kevin's like, yeah, I'm about to have lunch. He says, well, they're up on deck. You'll see them. And he goes up on deck thinking this guy is full of it because it's high noon. This is a 600-foot Navy ship with, 100 people on it. And sure enough, goes up on deck and there's this giant UFO, which was sparkling with these colored lights. It was 3 times bigger than the ship, he said, and off quarter mile, half mile to the side. And he does whatever, what I always tell everyone to do. If you see something like this, get another witness. Get another witness. And he runs up to Tony, the mess cook, and cannot get his attention. Can't get anyone's attention. And next thing he knows, he's looking down at his Navy ship, and it's receding into the distance. And long story short, I mean, this was a prolonged encounter, fully conscious. But he started talking to them mentally. He refused to turn around. He was too scared. He's like, I'm AWOL. They're like, no, you're not. No one even knows you're gone. And he asked him all these questions. Where are you from? And they showed him a star chart and gave him the name of some star, which he can't pronounce. He tried. It was just a meaningless word. And he's like, are you going to eat me? And they said, no, we eat, fish and fruit and vegetables. You watch a lot of horror movies, don't you? So it was very a human conversation. He said, are you for real? And he's like, hey, yeah, we're for real. He's like, is Roswell real? And I said, yes. And they gave him all these predictions that said, they warned him about nuclear bombs. Basically said, since we started using nuclear material and exploding bombs, it's caused all these things to happen. He showed him all these hurricanes in full color. He says it was like looking out a window. So it's a long, prolonged encounter. Quite a bit happened, but at some point he finally turns. He's asking, "What do you look like?" And they said, "Well, we're not little and we're not green. If that's what you think, but our appearance can be frightening, just so you know." And he turns around, and he was very frightened because they were 15-foot tall praying mantis, bone white, enormous triangular heads, eyes the size of basketballs, oozing, superior intelligence in a way. They told him that. It said, basically, we know everything about you. We can speak every language on this planet. Would you like to go to our planet? And he said no. And
why do you say no?
He said no.
Yes.
Yeah. He says, Preston, you don't understand. I'm like, because that's what I said. I'm like, how could you say no? This is an incredible opportunity. He says, yeah, well, you'd think so. But when you're standing there, shaking in your boots, he says, I nearly crapped my pants. I felt like a bug next to them. They were very big. I felt very vulnerable. And he said they were completely friendly, but he was shook up. And he says one of them walked, the room would change size, by the way. He kind of looked at me when I asked him, how big is the room? He gave me this look like, I don't know how to tell you this, but it changed size. I'm like, okay, this is a good detail. This is one of those little, not super well-known things, certainly among the general public, that can help you to confirm a person's story. But he, being a Navy medic, I talked to his wife, talked to his brother. I do my due diligence. I verified his employment. So at any rate, he says one of these guys stood up. It was sitting on what looked like a sort of a stone chair on a dais. Stood up and took about 2 or 3 steps, which is about 10, 6 to 10 foot strides, right up to him, and put it. And that's when he asked him, "Do you want to go to our planet?" He said, "No." And they said, "Okay, we'll take you back." And put its claw, he said, kind of a claw, on his shoulder, and he stiffened and screamed bloody murder. And that's the last he remembers. He woke up.
Was it hurt or?
No, he was just frightened. He was just purely frightened. He says, you got to forgive me. I've been through some pretty hairy situations. I'm a tough guy, but you don't know what it's like to have someone that tall standing next to you. I'm like, are you sure they were 15 feet tall? Because usually I hear maybe 9 feet, 10, 12. Not really. Usually it's about 6 to 9 feet. He's like, listen, they were more than twice my height. He's a trained observer. He said it was like looking up at a basketball hoop,
and a half, right?
And so, he had to look up to him. He says, "That's how tall they were. I don't know what to tell you." Okay, I'm not second guessing you. I just want to get an accurate description. But yeah, he says as soon as they touched him, that was more than he could take, and he blacked out. And he woke up hyperventilating, covered with sweat, laying down on his bunk, which is not where he started from, by the way. He was on deck. And as soon as he's there, the curtains, they have little curtains that go around your bunk. they whipped open, and there's his friend, Lewis, grinning from ear to ear, saying, "So, how did you like your little ride?" And he broke up with that guy. He's like, "You're not my friend. Go away." He was mad, and he regretted that later. But that was his experience in a nutshell. There was more to it, but that was one account that really impressed me. And another real quick, was a teacher.
We still have plenty of time.
Yeah, this lady contacted me because she read that in my book, Inside UFOs. It's the first chapter. And she's like, "I'm so glad you put that out there because I don't tell anybody this." But I was jogging out in 2001 outside of my home in O'Fallon, Illinois. Tiny little town. I looked it up. I verified every street she listed and her whole pathway, that she was out jogging early one morning. She likes to jog at 4 a.m. with her dog. And went down her street, went down another street, and up to this street called Kyle Avenue, which is a T intersection where there is a large streetlight. And she saw what she thought was a man on stilts walking down the center of Kyle Road. This is not a busy street, but there's cars on it during the day. There were none at 4 a.m. And she's like, "What the heck?" Her dog noticed it first, actually, because she's just jogging along. Her dog stopped. She's thinking, "Oh, it's going to be a deer, or a raccoon or fox," because there was quite a bit of rural terrain around there. Mm-hmm. High school on the left, a cornfield on the right that was plowed. And her dog stops, and she looks up, and she's like, "Gosh, look at that guy. He looks weird. He looks like he's on stilts with extenders on his arms." And taking 6-foot strides and booking it down towards the T intersection towards the left. She's 100 feet away or so, and it walks right under the streetlight. And that's when she goes, "Oh my God," because this thing is not a man, it's a praying mantis. It's 15 feet tall because she saw it against the streetlight. And it went right under the streetlight, and she said it was mottled gray, pencil thin, very long stick-like limbs, up, front arms up like a sort of puppy dog, curled forward, which is how it's often described, moving in sort of jerky movements, little details that I know, but most people wouldn't. Triangular head, very large black eyes. That was the only real color on it, was the black eyes. And it was moving back and forth with its head pointed downwards as if scanning the road, looking for something. And just went right on going, and she and her dog ran after it up to the intersection, right? And she saw it turn off into the cornfield.
The guy in the Navy was terrified of these things. She's not.
She's a teacher, she's a daycare worker, and ran towards it, and went to where it went out into the cornfield, and didn't see it, of course. Went jogging the next day looking for it, and every day after that, it didn't stop her. But she did not see where it went, never saw a UFO. And I'm like, "Listen, what's out there? Is there anything in this area that might, draw this in there?" She's like, "There's nothing out there. High school, a cornfield. They put up a water tower there, but I don't believe it was there at the time." And she said, "There is one thing that I thought of. Scott Air Force Base is 6 miles away."
There you go.
And she invited a colonel over from Scott Air Force Base to her home. Her husband did. And she found herself spilling the story, which surprised her because she doesn't tell people. She doesn't talk about it. Only her family knows. And
was this the Air Force Office of Special Investigations?
I don't think so. It was just, I don't know.
Okay, that's better. That's better. If those people show up.
No, this was a personal invite from a friend who happened to be a colonel at the base. She brought it up. She's like, "Oh gosh, why am I saying this?" Because he's looking at her. And she's like, "Well, what do you think?" And he's like, "No comment. Weird things happen around here." Or he said something along those lines, and quickly and awkwardly changed the conversation. And she was talking to me like this was a one-off. And I dug deep, and it turned out, no, of course it wasn't. She did have a full-on visitation as a young kid, a couple of other sightings of not human beings, the whole psychic stuff, and another UFO sighting. So it's clear that there was more to it, because I wondered about it. If this, she's like, it didn't see me. I'm like, okay, well, maybe you're right. I guess it didn't. I mean, that was her perception. She didn't have missing time. But yeah, what a strange sighting that was.
Now, what about where are they from?
I don't know. I don't know, Sean. There, I think it's a populated universe out there. We live on a planet, orbiting a star, and people are all over here in the UFO community are like, well, they're interdimensional beings. They're not aliens at all. They're wearing masks. They're demonic. They're time travelers from the future. I'm like,
Yeah, everyone's
hold
certain.
on.
Yeah, everyone's certain, right?
Yeah. I mean, Jacques Vallée is a very prominent and popular and certainly knowledgeable researcher who is pushing a theory that these are not ETs because it's too strange. There's too many of them. And that's basically his argument. I'm like, well, he says that they're manifesting in their, manipulating our belief system. They're just pretending because this is the zeitgeist that we're in of extraterrestrials being out there. Well, hold on a second. If they're manifesting and then disappearing, you're saying this is anthropocentric? That it's based on us? How are they manifesting? What's the mechanism? How do you explain this in any way that makes any sense at all? And he can't. None of these people who are pushing this phenomena or intelligence theory have any mechanism behind it, whereas the extraterrestrial explanation fits so perfectly in there. Yeah, it's strange. But who are we? Are we not living on a planet? We know this. I mean, we're fairly certain that we're biological beings who, yeah, are interdimensional too. Who's not? I'm a proponent of the ET theory, having had an experience myself. I'd like to take these people on board, and then they'd change their tune, because once you see an ET face to face, you're done. I mean, So I think that they are from planets. I really do. They're from other planets. I haven't been there. I've talked to people who have. I find their testimony very compelling, more so as I dig deeper into this. But I see no reason why most of this can't be explained as extraterrestrials from other planets, wherever they want to, people say, well, they're too far away. Yeah, if you take a rocket. But if you have that kind of craft, which is a living being in and of itself, and can travel interdimensionally, and can basically hit any point in the known galaxy, or beyond for that matter, and go through what Dolly Saffron calls a light gate, you can travel immense distances instantly. There's no reason why these can't be ET. And that's what the evidence is showing us, because people are taken on board, and they're not in their rooms. And these things are landing, and they're glassifying the ground at 3,000 degrees. And these darn things show up on radar. And if you believe the whistleblower accounts, and I think we should, because there's a lot of them, they're very consistent. We have these craft. They are being reverse engineered, and the bodies are, being held in various bases across the U.S. and the world. People have implants in their bodies, for Pete's sake. Is a weird interdimensional intelligence doing that? And furthermore, let's look at the behavior of these beings hovering over military bases, warning us about nuclear proliferation, hovering over mines, doing what amounts to clearly a survey, hydroelectric dams. They show a great interest in anything technological. That does not sound demonic to me. Does not sound like a spiritual intelligence. This sounds like someone like us, what we would do. My assessment.
Now you have kind of the first three. What other type? Well, actually, I have a very specific question about this. So the Pascagoula incident, the ETs that were described there, I don't think have ever been, as far as I know, have ever been described like that before or since. They're very unique. Is that accurate?
I think those were probably suits, honestly. because Charlie Hickson and Calvin Parker did describe other experiences where they had fingers and were more humanoid. So I suspect, I don't know. That is definitely unique. I think there was another lady in the area who had an onboard experience, but just described it in similar terms. But there are, people describe some of these guys wearing fishbowl helmets, and others have none at all. Diver suits are very common, or jumpsuits. That's the most popular fashion statement, galaxy-wise. It's these little tight, skin-tight, tan, silver, black, or blue jumpsuits. Usually, and sometimes gold, rarely red does turn up. But yeah, I don't know. It's hard to say because there's an element of uniqueness to each encounter. 80%, 90% are usually details I've heard 100 times. I've had people describe nothing new. Every single thing they say I've heard before, from the everything on board, to the tools, to the behavior, to the chairs, the walls, the words said, the sequence of events. Nothing new. But usually people will describe some detail that's a little different, and that often is the description of the ETs, whether it's their height or the clothes they wear or the placement of their eyes. There's an element of that there for sure. But yeah, grays are most common, but you have huge variation in that. Some people say, well, they weren't really gray. They were much more kind of pink, flesh toned, or very much dark gray, or darker skinned, or white, bone white, or yellowish. They had a little bit of a greenish tint. Looked a little blue to me. They had this kind of reddish orange look to them. Sometimes I think it might be the lights or your own perception. Your own belief system plays a role here, which is unfortunate. But the fact is, people aren't, generally speaking, great observers. That's why I love a multi-witness case, because you start to see that. Because one person will say this, and while the most details match, some don't. But often you get a more clear view, because people will describe stuff that could be an element of pareidolia going on here, in a sense that they're not so much pareidolia but straight up delusion, or placing stuff that's not there. Looking through the lens of their belief system can be a powerful factor here, because if you're super religious, and I've talked to people, they're sure it's a demon. I've talked them through it, and some are like, maybe you're right. Maybe it wasn't. And others like, I'm telling you, this thing, it wore a mask. I'm sure of it. I'm like, how are you sure? Like, I could just tell. Okay. It's not my job to interpret your experience for you. It's my job to try to help you through it and help explain it, answer your questions, maybe provide some clarity and insight, provide you the tools to cope with it, this sort of thing. But I'm not going to step all over someone's belief system. It's, that's rude. If they feel this way, that's perfectly fine. It's their experience.
Yeah, you just have to focus on the fact.
Plays a role.
Just get the details, and then any interpretation you kind of just have to. You can record it, but you can put it to the side, right?
Yeah, I will work with people who are like dead scared of what's happening to them. So let's just step back and let's tell me exactly what they did to you. Why was this so scary? And ultimately, it comes down to a loss of control. They feel like perhaps they didn't ask for it. They don't remember the experience in its entirety. So they're like, what happened to me? And will this happen again? And how can I control this? And can I have any measure of back and forth with this? And if you work with them and people continue to have encounters, in most cases, they develop a much more interactive, benevolent sort of viewpoint, and flat out interactions with them. So yeah, I think it's important that people just try to move past fear. That's what I always tell people who are having these encounters. Write everything down. Let's look at exactly what happened to you, because you're here now. You survived this. You're fine. let's dig into your childhood. Ask everyone around you, have they had encounters? Let's see what's going on here. Why do you think they are contacting you? And we sort of move forward through this so they can get a better understanding of what's happening to them.
Now, what do you make of claims that some contactees, abductees, wherever they call themselves in that particular moment, some of them claim that they invoke the name of Jesus, and these entities will leave? What do you make of those claims?
Well, I've looked into it, and I interviewed and talked to and been on some panels with people who are absolutely convinced that this is demonic, and if you use the name of Jesus, they'll go away. So I went into the files of MUFON, and you can do word searches, basically buzzwords, and I typed in Jesus and I typed in demon, and and I looked for every single case, and I scoured the literature. I'm like, let's dig deep. I found a lot of cases, people who thought they were angelic, a lot. And I found a few cases where people saw a UFO and said, in the name of Jesus, go. And the UFO went on its merry way. That to me is not good evidence that your statement, caused the behavior of that UFO, affected it in any way. Because maybe it was just going on its way. Now, if someone's on the table and they're like, in the name of Jesus, put me back, and it does. I found a couple of cases. But when you look at the fact that there are, probably tens of thousands of these kinds of cases, we're approaching that number. It's statistically insignificant. It's got to be at least 10% for this to be a good, what is called significant. And it's below that. Now, there are researchers out there who dig into this, and that's their deal. And they're religious. And I am not so sure I entirely trust them, because they're looking at it through the lens of their belief system. They're very strongly religious. And that you do what I call cherry picking and shoe fitting. And you throw away the stuff that doesn't fit. And frankly, if I were to take, say I'm a doctor and I'm putting someone on the table to examine them, and they start losing their minds and say, in the name of Jesus, get the hell away from me. And
stop.
I'm like, okay, I'm leaving because this person obviously is not ready. It's not Jesus' name that causes them to leave necessarily. Now, I'm not going to discount this completely, because this is a person's belief, and if they want to believe this, I am not going to say that it's not true. But, Anne Druffel wrote a book on this, How to Defend Yourself Against Alien Abduction. It says religious provocation is one of the methods. And she herself had one or two cases. This is the book on it. And what works much more often is, no, get away from me. What she called willful, I forget what she had a name for it, righteous anger, which, I have cases of that where people will say, get away from me. I never want to see you again. Go away, go away, go away. I'm not working with you. And it ends their encounters, usually temporarily, because they'll come back, but sometimes permanently. And yeah, I talked about this with Dolly Saffron. She's like, oh yeah, we've not worked with people because they lose their minds, But this is my personal feeling on this. I don't know that is an effective method. Now, if you're dealing with a straight up demon, because those are real, but I don't think they manifest as ETs. I investigated demonic hauntings. I personally did. The people who were possessed by, 10-foot tall, dark, amorphous forms who tried to possess them and were causing vicious hauntings. It follows a very set pattern. It's a spiritual phenomenon. It's different. It's a haunting. This is not what's going on with the ETs. Now, there's a guy out there who says, I have 300 cases of this. And so, you can talk to him. I'm sure you'll get a different answer. But my assessment that no, ETs are not demonic. And if you're going to call in the name of Jesus and say, stop right now, they'll say, okay, that's what you want. We will stop. But it's not Jesus doing it. My opinion. I really want to underline that, because religion is a very sensitive core belief with people. sex, politics, religion. And you can stick UFOs in there because it affects who you are and how you feel about your place in the universe. And that's why this is, some people are diehard skeptics and said, don't talk to me about this. I don't want to talk about it because it's a core belief. And that suddenly you're dealing with 2 or 3 core beliefs at once, sex and ETs and religion. It's all coming at people at once. And so this is what causes people to have complete spiritual transformations, throw away their worldview. I interviewed one guy who was a diehard Mormon. And he says, Preston, I gave it up. Because as soon as this gray came into my room, I remembered being with him throughout my childhood. I looked upon him as a friend, a father, a mentor, and went on board and had a really benevolent experience at age 23 or so, but all the others weren't so benevolent. It was rough up to that age. When he finally clicked, woke up, he reached that level of moving beyond the blindness of your belief system. And it can be agnosticism or atheism or whatever you believe in. I had the good fortune to have my belief system destroyed by the idea that UFOs are real, and I was having out-of-body experiences, and everything just went whoosh. I'm like, I'm not believing in anything anymore. This is ridiculous. I just need to know what's going on.
Right.
So yeah,
right. You have a personal experience. Right. That's the best way to kind of learn all
so
this.
Yeah, it work. I think it works, but perhaps not for the reasons people think.
So Sooty S was asking, have you ever had a QHHT session?
No, I haven't. Quantum hypnotherapy, which is a method basically developed by Dolores Cannon, who is a good researcher, by the way. I did have the opportunity to meet her very briefly at a convention, but she had a line of people at her table, and I just wanted to say, hey, I respect you. Because her books are good. And what I like about her, what she does is she just lays it out. She's not overlaying any, belief system or interpretation. She's reporting what she's learned. Yep. And she uses hypnosis. And I think it is an effective method if used and done correctly. I've interviewed a few people. Martin Rivera is another guy, I think, who does a really good job with this. I've talked, of course, to Barbara Lamb and Yvonne Smith extensively about their use of hypnosis. It 100% works. And everyone uses slightly different methods. Quantum hypnotherapy is one of them. And Deb's Shakti, she's one who's quite active in the field doing this. I interviewed a lady who's in my book who used it to recall her experiences, and it was done correctly. And it's not, a question and answer session. It's where you allow the witness to basically reach a level of relaxation where they can move into their memories in a way that is not leading. And they can just sort of say, well, I saw a face. And the hypnotist will say, okay, you saw a face. And repeat what they said without. So yeah, it's very effective. But we know from studies that it's not always effective. There's been very, strict.
Say a little bit about that, because I've talked to people about the positive aspects of it, but what are some of the risks? And again, I don't want to make it like it's good or bad, and I'm not talking about QHHT. It could also be regular hypnotherapy session. What are the pitfalls, and what can you do to kind of mitigate that if somebody's interested in learning more about it?
I think the main pitfall would be you get a hold of someone who's a little zealous, might have a belief system where ETs are trying to take over, or the Greys are doing this and that, or and will project that onto your recall and will lead you down their garden path towards what they believe, which I think is what's happened with some prominent researchers who take a very negative viewpoint towards this. That's a danger, because we know that people can be led, particularly if they're vulnerable to it in some way. And there's been enough studies on hypnosis where people said, oh, I recalled this person abusing me, and it's not true. It did not happen, and they can prove it. That's a danger, false memory syndrome. But I know it works because people who recall under hypnosis are recalling the same things people who remember it fully consciously. Another pitfall is, well, I had this missing time event and I went to explore it under hypnosis. And I found out I have 20 of these and it opened a can of worms. And, this is much more extensive than I thought. It's completely changed my life. And that's, something to be prepared for. This can be a lot to deal with suddenly. And that's another pitfall, because basically what it comes down to, this is what the ETs are telling contactees. It's not really us doing it. You did not want to remember. We facilitated that. You will remember when you're ready. And I've talked to a lot of people who've had that cue or trigger, something in their lives happens where it brings it all back fully consciously. That's the ideal road. That's what I'm waiting for, because I have missing time. I've considered hypnosis. I've not done it, but I'm remembering stuff, right? That's, I think, how the best method, because basically what hypnosis is like forcing a flower to bloom. Yeah, you can, but it's not it's not necessarily the best method. It can be. I only recommend hypnosis if a person has a very clear-cut reason to do it. They had missing time and they know it. They are having anxieties over this. They are not able to function at a normal level due to what's happened to them. If you have crippling anxiety, if you can't sleep, if you feel like you've got PTSD, if you really, 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 really want to know, yes, I think it's good to do. But yeah, there are pitfalls to it. It can become overwhelming. You might not. I've talked to people who were like, okay, I did it and I kind of regret it. I'm like, oh, really? Why? I said, well, it's not that I don't trust what happened, but it feels very dreamlike. What I asked for hypnotic recall and I got one. I got this weird hypnotic thing and I still don't know if it's real. Whereas if you were just laying there and you kind of did it through meditation, because that's how Jay Gardner, a guy I interviewed, he talked to, I think it was Leo Sprinkle, who does hypnotize people. He says, before I do this, let me give you some meditation techniques. I want you to try this first. And he did it. And he remembered everything himself. It's a much better method. So if you're considering hypnosis, first thing I would ask you to do is write everything down in detail. Because that way, when you go under hypnosis, you can say, well, I remember this. And this is hypnotic. Another thing would be meditate, meditate, meditate. Pick that experience and just sit there and think on it for a month, every day for an hour. And keep writing it down, because you get these little details. They will come in, through the back door on the side and like, oh gosh, I do remember it smiled. Oh yeah, it did touch me. I remembered its jumpsuit. It was blue, or, little things like that. You can start to build a more clear picture. Third, and this works, and it's kind of, I don't know what I want to say controversial, but it might be considered that. Dream work. When you go to bed at night, ask to dream about your experience. Because this is how Betty Hill did it. She went to bed that night and she's like, I dreamt I was on board and this happened, this happened, this happened. She went under hypnosis and darned if her dream recall wasn't accurate and a little bit more complete, honestly.
And for folks who are just joining us, you're listening to Through a Glass Darkly Radio on United Public Radio, and I'm here talking with UFO researcher Preston Dennett. All right, I have about, I think, 10 minutes left in the discussion. We talked about the first three, right? So just as a reminder, grays, human-like, and mantids. What other types do you typically see in your
we talked about some of the extraordinarily tall humanoids.
Yeah, kind of like giant,
Because I got a couple more of those. I mean, there was one lady who contacted me specifically because she's like, I saw this thing and I want to know if you've ever heard this. I'm like, well, after she told me, I'm like, no, I haven't. I have not heard this. And she described a 9-foot tall, orange-haired humanoid, which had not so much orange hair, but straw-like protrusions. Well, hair, but it was very straw-like, sticking straight up about 3 or 4 inches off of its head. A huge chin, very high forehead, wearing a black skin-tight jumpsuit and a cape. She muscular, but human looking. She was healed of a sort of hypoglycemic type disorder, which wasn't fully diagnosed, but was certainly verified medically. They didn't know what it was though. But that was another one of these tall humanoids. And I get those fairly regularly, but those are somewhat rare. I would say equally rare, but consistent are little blue beings. Dolly Saffron described them. My first case of that was with another sister-in-law who saw these little blue beings, along with her sister, by the way, when she was 9 years old, I think it was. And she's an artist. She does the cover for my books. I'm like, Christy, draw them. Please draw them. And she did. And I don't know if you've ever had the opportunity to see Communion, the movie with Christopher Walken about Whitley Strieber's experiences. But there's a scene where one of these kids is dressed up in a little costume in the hallway and frightens the daylights out of Christopher Walken playing Whitley. And it's this little troll-like blue-skinned being. I think that was the scene.
Yeah,
but
it's definitely.
It looks very much like that.
In the movie.
Yeah, it looks very much like that. And so she drew them. And little beady eyes, kind of Shar-Pei folded skin, hoods, short, flat faces, stubby fingers. People don't generally describe much of the body because they're usually cloaked with hoods. And this one guy I interviewed not very recently, but over the past couple of years, his account is in my book, Humanoids in High Strangeness. He lived in East Palo, Texas, and he and his little brother were visited, weekly by these little blue beings who carried this little wand, which is exactly what my sister-in-law described as well. And he contacted me because he saw the drawing she did and just about fell over. He's like, that's who did that? I'm like, that's my sister-in-law. He's like, that's exactly what I saw. Exactly. And in fact, the other guy I mentioned briefly, the Mormon, he had one of those come into his room when he was a little kid. He says, I thought it was a gorilla, tiny baby gorillas or something, until I got a good look at it. It looked kind of troll-like. So that is another type, which is just another ethnicity of humanoid. Because people are like, all these different races, 50 different races are visiting our planet. And look at you, you're a different race than me. And I'm like, well, no, you're not. We are all humans, every last one of us on this planet. And I don't care how tall or short you are, or how fat or wide, or what color your skin is, or how big your eyes are, your lips, or your nose, or your ears, or anything. You're a human. We're all human. And let's line us up, and look at the variation from height to skin color to shape. And you're going to see an enormous variation of what we call ancestry and ethnicity. And let's just, for fun, stick a tall white in there, and a gray, and a little blue being, and see if anyone can pull them out and say, this one's not human. Because some of them you would not be able to pull out. They would fit right in because the variation is that pronounced here on this planet alone. Yes, some of them are clearly a little different. The mantids, I think, would be pretty easy, in a lineup. The point I'm trying to make is this is what contactees are being told, that we share genetics. And Dolly Saffron, I'm going back to her again because they took her to other planets, and she's got the best memory of anyone I've heard of in terms of interactions, and the most interactions. She's like, I'm telling you, Preston, there's pine trees on other planets, and there's rabbits, and there's birds, and there's cows, and they all look a little different, just like the people look a little different. She took them to a planet where they were basically Polynesian, which is interesting because the Polynesians have, again, an oral tradition, as most indigenous cultures do, of, we come from the stars. So perhaps there's more to that. I'm not so sure we evolved on this planet, because contactees are being told, no, we did not.
Our
all
circadian rhythms are actually closer to Mars. Even though
Yeah.
Mars is still very close to the U.S. or to Earth. But
Which
all
is
right,
what
we have.
the guy from Texas told me, that the ETs told him that we came from Mars, which I had to laugh because that's what Dolly says. And I've heard this
Yeah.
from other people. We did live on Mars in one iteration way back.
Now I have to ask you this because it's kind of still in the zeitgeist. We're talking. Yeah, the Arrow report came out. It was complete gaslighting of humanity. I'm not optimistic that our government's going to say anything. Are ETs going to do something a little bit more open in terms of a disclosure sort of thing? U.S. government be damned.
Well, at some point, I think if we face an existential crisis and they like, you know what, we need to scoop our people off, or anyone who's at that level or ready or wants to go, yeah, because God knows they've already done it. I would point to the 1954 wave in France. I would point to
Well, just
wave
the
after
U.S.
wave.
too. Like there were massive. Like if you look at the history, it's hard to believe that people have quote unquote forgotten most of this stuff. I mean, it was pretty unambiguous. They were flying over the White House. They were doing all sorts of crazy stuff. It was unambiguous, but it just kind of disappeared from memory. It's very
Yeah.
strange.
Well, look up the date, November 6, 1957. Challenge you. Look up October, November 1973. That's called the year of the humanoids, but it was really ramping up on those 2 months, where they basically put on what we call a display. And they do this over and over again. I wrote the book Schoolyard UFO Encounters because that's what they're doing. UFOs over drive-in theaters. Look at all the various waves. They did it over Mexico City in 1991, unambiguously. A flying saucer right there, stayed for 2 hours. How much do you need? One guy, Donald Shallcross of Virginia, met the ETs face to face, and he asked them, "Why don't you disclose?" And they said, "We already have." That was in the 50s. So they are doing everything except staying there over New York City or LA or what have you, to a point where they'd circle jets and try to blow it up, and we don't react well to this. If we were less warlike, I think we'd have a much better chance. But yeah, disclosure has already happened. How many million? We're approaching 1 million documented sightings, encounters, in just the databases like APRO and NICAP and QFOS and MUFON and NUFORC. And that's just the United States, and we're not the center of the world.
Being in MUFON, and I know the answer to this, but I think the audience will find it interesting. While you were looking into various reports that have been stored on that database, have you ever seen one and then it kind of just disappeared from the database?
I have, yeah.
How often does that happen, and what sorts of cases does that happen to?
Well, I know people I've talked to are like, "Well, I reported it, and then it's gone." And I'm like, "Well, shoot!" And I went looking for it, and sure enough, it's gone. That happened with NUFORC. I'm like, "Well, that's weird. I took a screenshot of this one. It's not there anymore." So I don't know how often it happens, and I'm sure there are all kinds of glitches and database problems. I don't want to immediately point a nefarious finger at all of this, but I know people
you heard
are
about
very
the hack like a month ago or within the last month, right?
I'm not sure it's even back up the CMS system, but I support MUFON, because
no, this is not to point fingers at MUFON. It's to point fingers at somebody else.
yeah.
I don't think this is incompetence.
Here's my point: is APRO, they caught the CIA spying on them.
Yeah.
One of their field investigators turned out to be flat up CIA. NICAP was basically shut down due to political infighting. And there were some intelligence officers on the board of directors there.
Well, have you ever seen the Simple Sabotage Manual from World War II? Created by the Office of Strategic Services, which is a precursor to the CIA. There's a whole section on there. There's a whole section on there about how to derail meetings. Literally, like send everything to committees, right? Like reward the people who are the most useless, right? And
Well,
Like they've thought through this stuff pretty. I mean, like way back in the
well,
40s, they thought
we're
through
dealing
this.
with a very well-funded, organized, debunking, deliberate cover-up to make witnesses look like fools and slow, if not stop, the progress of UFO research. It's not a joke. It's for real. So
Well, I'll
it
give you an
should come
example.
as
So
no
there's another.
surprise.
We're kind of running over, but I'll give a quick example. There's another YouTuber who had Chris Bledsoe on, and Chris Bledsoe mentioned something about Tim Taylor, who was like a intelligence official who worked for the NRO, may still work for the NRO and Space Force, things like that. And his video was doing really well, and then all of a sudden it just hit a brick wall. So he called his little minder, because when you have more than 100,000 subscribers, you get somebody assigned to you at YouTube. And the woman said, yeah, I was told by the, at the executive level that it's getting shadow banned and there's no documentation on it, so I can't tell you what it is. So my guess is that someone high up in the intelligence community just called an executive at YouTube and just said, just, bury it. And that's kind of what happened.
It's unfortunate that we have to deal with this, but that's why UFO organizations have such a hard time, because we're up against a deliberate cover-up.
Well, I mean, I think you just have to operate under the mindset that everything your government tells you is probably a lie, and we're just not going to get disclosure through them. We're going to have to get it by ourselves. Even if it's dangerous, tough. I mean, tough. Like if they're supposed to protect us, yeah, they're not protecting us, right? And the other thing, it's destroying them. Like it's not helping that you can't. Like everything they say, nobody believes it. Even if it's true, nobody believes it. So it just further undermines their authority. And it's almost like this positive feedback loop where they tell a lie in order to prevent something, and then it just makes the next lie even more damaging and more damaging and more damaging until you have until it spirals out of control. So, all right, I think we're kind of near the end of the hour. So any last words? Something positive, because I just went down a dark road. My apologies for that.
Yeah. Well, first, thanks, Sean. I think we had, I had a good time.
Well, also, happy St. Paddy's Day from, your favorite Irishman. I've like buried the lead on that one. There's somebody in the comments kept telling me happy St. Patrick's Day. Happy St. There's a Kennedy. There's a Kennedy somewhere in the comments. So I had to say it.
Yeah. Happy St. Patrick's Day. I'm part Irish, so hey.
That's the best part. That's the best part. Okay.
Thanks for having me on the show. It's an important subject. You can't hide the truth. Sooner or later, it's going to come out because it is true. I don't trust our government. So, yeah, I'd say just leave fear behind. This is a new era for humanity. It's time to embrace this. You're not being credulous or, what do you call it? Not ignorant, but, credulous is the best word I can think of right now. If you believe in this stuff. Because the fact is, we're victims of a cover-up, and it is true, and it saddens me that people say, "Well, how do you know that this is true?" I'm like, "Well, are you going to believe our governments, or are you going to believe the million of people who say they're seeing this stuff?"
But Preston, they're here from the government, and they're here to help.
Yeah, but yeah, I think it's a new era, so people are embracing this. It's awesome. We're not alone out there. Leave fear behind. Look to your do your own research. Don't ask other people. Don't believe me. Do your own research. Ask your friends and family and coworkers. I dare you. You'll find out.
No, I mean, you literally, once you have a YouTube channel and it gets over 5,000 subscribers, people will call you and tell you their stories. There's actually somebody I need to refer to you, but I can't say anything about their case because they were they don't.
Yeah, I'm behind about 100 emails for anyone listening out there saying, well, I sent an email and he hasn't called me back. I am working on it because I am getting swamped right now, which is awesome. I absolutely love it. Keep them coming. And I'll get to you, I promise. But please be patient because, it is time for truth and it's coming out and I'm so excited about it.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Preston. Thanks, Dolly, in the background. And love you all. So happy St. Paddy's Day and don't drink too much. Have a great night.
You too.